Modern perception of feudalism is extremely negative. In fact, feudalism had some key benefits that were essential to the functioning and survival of the medieval society. Some of these were that feudalism, 1, protected peasants from the dangers of early European life. Secondly, it helped to establish larger, more stable political structures. And finally, feudalism led to the emergence of an aristocracy, which sought to limit the absolute power of the king, which laid the foundation for modern law. Violence was a big part of medieval Europe, and feudalism sought to safeguard people from it. Of course, by some of the peasants seeking protection from knights and people with more influence, especially which came in the form of castles and just arms and men to protect a certain amount of land. And they sought to protect the peasants, or feudalism sought to protect the peasants from excessive violence like gangs and just the absolute enormous homicide and murder rates. It was about 10. The murder rate was about 10 times the rate than today, which really goes to show how violent it was in the medieval times. And as Ian Mortimer says, quote, "The excessive violence was partially product of the fact adults in those days drank alcohol constantly." One of the reasons why they drank alcohol constantly was that it was considered the only drink that you could drink without really killing yourself, because water wasn't pure back then. It had tons of parasites and imperfections that were really dangerous to the human body. And alcohol was a big part of the violence, which can be seen in the St. Scholastic's Day riot, where on a Tuesday, on February 10th, 1355, some students at Oxford, I think, along with some priests, were drinking in the Swindlestock Tavern, and some complained that the quality of the wine wasn't good. And the landlord, which was John of Barford, who's also the mayor of Oxford, was alleged to have responded with stubborn and spicy language. And then a student threw a quart pot at his head, and this started the riot with the local people rallying around John of Barford, and they had the city church ring its bell to rally the townsfolk around John of Barford. And then the university retaliated by rousing its students with the university's church bell, in order to fight the local townspeople. And there was a battle between the townsmen and the students, and a lot of people were killed. And feudalism sought to stop this from reaching everybody. Secondly, feudalism also created political stability by decentralizing power among local lords and dukes, and by the local lords and dukes creating systems of defense against raiders. So, one of the things that laid the groundwork for this development was the collapse of the Carolingian Frankish Empire. And this created a lot of political instability. And the squabbling kings provided little or no protection from Viking, Muslim, or Magyar raiders. So the local dukes and counts filled in the power vacuum and started building defense systems like castles to provide protection and to project power around the surrounding lands. And this process made the local counts and dukes very powerful. And since they had a castle that could project power not only against enemies, but also against their superior lord, which made it a lot harder for for people to really have, or for kings especially, to keep their power, since the power really lay in the castles, and all the castles were in the local duke's hands. And they sought to solve this problem with feudalism, where it was based on personal loyalties and mutual obligations. This created a much more sustainable and stable structure than just ruling out of fear, or at least among the nobility, that it wasn't a rule among fear, with fear. It was just mutual obligations and personal loyalties that kept the peace. And this was a lot more stable than, a king with his iron fist swinging it around his local dukes, and it was a lot less destructive too. And the church also played a huge part in making these agreements work, since they put religious sanction on them, which gave them extra weight and put extra responsibility on the person to actually fulfill their mutual obligations and their oaths to their superior lords. And with this system in place, Joseph Strayer says, quote, "There was a notable increase in Western European political stability following 1000 AD, which is about 100 years after the Carolingian collapse. And after this a milestone of 1000 AD, there followed economic revival and a huge increase in agricultural production, which led to even more political stability, because people are happy and people are being fed. That creates a lot more stability than hungry, angry people. So finally, feudalism also led the way to the concept of the balance of powers, and also forged ideas that helped to make modern law. And this kind of idea formed out of the local power, again, of the barons, because the barons had independent military power, and they could use this power collectively to extract concessions from the king. As Lisa Blades says, quote, "The independent military power of the barons allowed for a degree of bargaining strength vis-a-vis the monarchy, as the barons could either rebel against the king or support an opposition figure." So this allowed for the barons to have huge amounts of influence over the king, or make him give at least some concessions to the local lords, which chipped away at the concept of absolute power among the kingship in medieval Europe. And so some of these concessions were actually institutionalized or written down with the Magna Carta in 1215, which sought to limit the power of the king. And the barons also managed to establish a European, or more specifically a English parliament that was populated by themselves and knights in around 1265 AD. Feudalism also created movements that sought to regulate war. Like, we have the Geneva Convention, and that came out of the feudalism, the environment that feudalism created. Feudalism created movements like the Truce of God, or the Peace of God, which sought to regulate war and to standardize war so that it's fought in a orderly, it's fought without anyone committing war crimes. Like, they sought to prohibit fighting in designated consecrated places or holy places, like churches or monasteries. And they also sought to stop wars from being fought on certain days, like Sundays or feast days. This was then expanded to other days too, but they basically sought to limit war so that they wouldn't have any total war, or the concepts of total war. They wanted to fight it in an honorly manner. So, while the modern perception of feudalism is extremely negative, in fact, feudalism had key benefits that were essential to the functioning and survival of medieval society. It protected peasants from the dangers of early European life, from violence and gangs. It also helped establish larger, more stable political structures and entities. Finally, it led to the emergence of an aristocracy which sought to limit the absolute power of the king and laid the foundation of modern law. Thank you.